My future mother-in-law looked me dead in the eyes, raised her cocktail glass, and said, "Pay $200,000 or forget my son." Then she threw it at me. My name is Kendall Jenner. I'm 31, the founder and CEO of an educational tech startup based in Austin. I grew up just west of Dallas, raised by a single father who fixed HVAC systems and taught me how to write invoices before I learned algebra. Nothing in my childhood was curated or glamorous. Our AC broke every other summer, and my first phone was a hand-me-down flip from a neighbor who felt sorry for me. But I had grit, and it stuck. I graduated from UT Austin with a degree in developmental psychology. And 3 years later, I launched BrightPath, a software platform that helped elementary schools train emotional literacy through gamified interaction. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. And within 4 years, we had contracts in 15 school districts across the country. We were growing. We had a mission. And we were making real change. I wasn't looking for love. Not until Grayson Langford sat down next to me at an education conference in San Diego and complimented my slides on empathy mapping. He wasn't charming in the polished, cheesy way that tech guys sometimes try to be. He was measured, calm, a little bit intense, but in a way that made you feel like you had his full attention. We started talking that evening and didn't stop. By month 3, we were doing weekend getaways. By month 8, he'd moved into my apartment. Grayson worked in private equity, specializing in education sector portfolios. He was financially secure, but more than that, he was deeply curious about how I built BrightPath. He asked the kinds of questions most men didn't even think to ask. And when he surprised me with a custom whiteboard for my home office, I thought maybe I'd finally found someone who actually saw me. He proposed on a Sunday morning in our kitchen, barefoot, with a ring he said had been in his family for 4 generations. I didn't hesitate. I said yes. Then I met his mother. The invitation came formally, an embossed card with gold edges, hand-delivered by Grayson himself. My mother prefers doing things in person, he explained. She says first impressions are sacred. I'd seen pictures of Meredith Langford in business publications. She was chair of the Langford Foundation, which funded dozens of classical music, STEM, and women's education initiatives across Texas. Her name was everywhere, but she herself was hard to pin down. Grayson never said much about her, except that she was very particular and deeply committed to legacy. I thought it was just rich family code for eccentric. I didn't realize until later that it was a warning. The dinner was at her home in River Oaks, a mansion that looked more like a museum than a place where humans actually lived. The foyer had marble floors that echoed when I walked, and a spiral staircase that looked like it had never once heard children's laughter. I wore a forest green dress that hit just below the knee, modest but elegant, and carried a bottle of Pinot Grigio as a hostess gift. Meredith didn't take it. She glanced at the label, raised one eyebrow, and gestured to the butler instead. "We only serve French reds," she said, as if that were something everyone knew. The first half hour was mostly small talk and silence. Grayson's father, Edward, asked a few kind questions about BrightPath's latest district rollout, but his mother didn't speak until the appetizers were cleared. "So," she began, swirling hair, "drink slowly. Grayson tells me you're in tech." I nodded. Explained our mission. She nodded back, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Interesting," she said. "It's always nice when girls have hobbies." I told her it wasn't a hobby. That we served over 40,000 students. That we had a waiting list of districts. She sipped her cocktail. "That's sweet," she said. Then she turned to Grayson. "You should take her to Paris before she burns herself out." I tried to laugh it off, to find some common ground, but every word I said was met with subtle corrections. My pronunciation of charcuterie was off. My posture too casual. The way I praised the flowers was a bit pedestrian. I could feel Grayson freeze beside me, silently enduring. I tried to catch his eye, but he kept cutting his lamb and sipping his wine. Then dessert came. And so did the moment I stopped being someone's fiancé and started being an outsider who needed to prove her worth. Meredith clinked her spoon against her glass. "Let's not waste time," she said. "If you want to marry my son, you'll need to contribute $200,000 to the Langford Family Trust. We call it a preservation fee, a token of your understanding of what it means to join legacy." I thought she was joking. I smiled. She didn't. She raised her glass. "To clarity," she said, and threw the drink in my face. That's the night I learned. Some families don't want daughters-in-law. They want transactions. And some men, they're just messengers in nicer suits. The sound of glass hitting ceramic echoed louder than I expected. A small splash of the cocktail landed on the tablecloth, but most of it ran down my cheek and onto my lap. My dress, carefully chosen to strike the right balance between elegance and modesty. I was soaked with something citrus and humiliating. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I could hear the butler freeze mid-step. I could hear the air conditioning humming above the chandelier, but I couldn't hear Grayson say anything. I turned to him, waiting, expecting him to look shocked or angry or even confused. Instead, he looked tired. Not surprised. Not hurt. Just tired. And like this was something he'd braced himself for, and hoped wouldn't happen, but also knew it probably would. That expression stayed with me far longer than the cold drink. Meredith placed her glass down gently, as if she'd just toasted a wedding. "Now that the formalities are out of the way," she said, "we can proceed. Like adults." I remember blinking, trying to process if this was real. The woman had thrown a drink in my face and asked for $200,000 as if it were a country club fee. And Grayson just sat there, folding his napkin. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Only fragments. I wiped my face. I muttered something polite. I excused myself early. I didn't cry until I got home. And even then, it wasn't the wine, or the insult, or the obscene request that cracked me open. It was that look on Grayson's face. Not protective. Not outraged. Just resigned. The next morning, I woke up in the same apartment I had worked out of, when Bright Path was just an idea on a whiteboard. Everything was where it had always been. My framed first contract still sat by the espresso machine. My desk still had the post-its from last quarter's goal setting. But the world felt off balance. The man who had cheered for every milestone in my company, who had claimed he loved my mind, had just watched his mother publicly humiliate me like I was some rogue intern who didn't pass screening. And worse, he had called it tradition. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. I told myself, maybe it was a test. A twisted way for her to measure my resolve. That maybe, in some convoluted, outdated way, it was meant to break the ice, and not me. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't a test. It was a price tag. Meredith Langford didn't see me as a person. She saw me as an acquisition risk. Grayson came by that afternoon with a bouquet of white peonies, his mother's favorite. I didn't ask why he brought those instead of mine. He kissed my cheek and said nothing about the dinner. Just sat on the couch like nothing had happened. It took 10 minutes before I broke the silence. "Are you going to pretend last night didn't happen?" He paused, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look, I know my mom can be intense. She's just very protective." I stood, walked into the kitchen, and didn't respond. He followed. "It's just how she is," he said again, as if that excused throwing a drink in someone's face. I turned to him. "You laughed. You sat there, and you let her insult me in front of everyone." He didn't deny it. "She did the same thing to my sister-in-law. Years ago. And Jennifer eventually got used to her. Everyone does." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. "So, this is normal to you? Being priced? Like some piece of stock?" He exhaled. It's not about price. It's about commitment. In her world, money is proof of intent. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words. In her world, everyone does. Proof of intent. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was stunned. How had I not seen this earlier? There had been signs. His quiet discomfort anytime I asked about his family. His tendency to brush off personal questions with economic metaphors. And now it made sense. Grayson didn't see his mother's demand as an act of aggression. He saw it as tradition, as a cost of entry. But what he didn't see was what it said about him. That he was not offering partnership. He was offering conditional access. 2 days later, I received an email from Meredith's office. It was brief and clinical. Dear Miss Jenner, attached, please find wiring instructions for the Langford Trust contribution. Deadline for transfer is 30 calendar days from engagement confirmation. No exceptions. Beneath it was a note from her assistant about scheduling a meeting with my team at BrightPath to discuss long-term strategic alignment. I sat there staring at my screen, wondering how the woman who had just degraded me could still believe she had the right to negotiate contracts with my company. Then it hit me. She didn't just want a dowry. She wanted control. I forwarded the email to Chloe, my COO and closest friend. 2 minutes later she called. Please tell me this is a prank, she said. I told her no. It wasn't. You know what this is. Right, she said, her voice tight. This isn't just personal. She's using your company as leverage. She wants to own you. I nodded. Even though she couldn't see me, I felt it too. And that's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for my dignity. I was fighting for my life's work. And some wars start quietly with an email, a wine glass, and a man who didn't say a word when it mattered. 3 nights after the email, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the engagement ring. The emerald looked expensive, cold, and strangely unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else's life. I had placed it in a shallow ceramic bowl, right next to the contract memo Meredith had sent. $200,000. No explanation, no discussion, just a deadline and a demand. Outside, the city moved as usual. Horns honked, lights blinked. Somewhere, a couple was probably planning a honeymoon. And here I was, trying to decide whether my future was something I could still recognize, or if it had already been redesigned without my consent. The next day, I walked into the BrightPath office on South Congress with the same calm face I always wore. Chloe was already there, fielding 3 meetings and prepping for a potential contract with a charter network in Oregon. She didn't bring up the Langford situation until the door to my office was closed. So what's the play? She asked. Not unkindly. I told her I didn't know yet, that I wasn't sure if there was a play at all. I was trying to figure out if this was something I could navigate or something I had to burn down. You shouldn't even be thinking about paying, she said. Not just because it's ridiculous, but because it's dangerous. If you pay, it won't end there. I nodded, even though part of me still wanted to believe. This was just one awful moment, not a pattern. Grayson texted later that evening. Mom says she's open to extending the deadline if that helps. No apology. No, I'm sorry she treated you like that. Just a logistical adjustment. I didn't respond. I spent that night researching other women in legacy families. There were blogs, a few op-eds, even a podcast episode or 2. Most stories didn't go viral. Most of them didn't even end in disaster. But all of them had something in common: women who were forced to give up pieces of themselves in exchange for proximity. One woman gave up her career. Another was told to stop speaking publicly. A third was required to delete all photos from her social media that included her pre-marriage last name, all of it framed as respecting tradition. I remembered a moment from the night of the dinner. Just after the drink had landed, Meredith said something that hadn't made sense to me until now. We expect our daughters-in-law to understand the value of structure. At the time, I had thought she meant financial structure. Now I realized she meant control. BrightPath had grown because it rejected rigidity. Our software was built around emotional flexibility, empathy, context. Everything about my work stood in contrast to the Langford worldview. And that's when it hit me. Meredith didn't hate me. She didn't even care enough to hate me. What she wanted was for me to become absorbable. She wanted to know that no matter how independent or successful I appeared, I would eventually bend. That Friday, I got an alert that Meredith had requested a meeting with our product team. The request came not through me, but through our client portal, just like any regular enterprise customer. The note said she'd like to discuss deeper customizations to the Langford School Network contract. It looked formal, even helpful on the surface, but Chloe flagged it immediately. "You realize what she's doing, right?" she asked. "She's tightening her grip. If we agree to changes now, we're setting a precedent that she's allowed to dictate direction." I told her not to accept the meeting. Chloe looked at me for a long moment, and then said something that would stay with me for weeks. "This isn't about your engagement anymore. This is a test of who owns BrightPath, you or them." By Sunday, the weight in my chest wouldn't go away. I texted Grayson, asked if he wanted to meet for coffee. We sat on the patio of a cafe we used to visit when we were just dating, back when everything felt mutual and easy. He wore a navy blue sweater and asked about the Oregon contract, as if things were normal. After a few minutes of silence, I asked the question that had been clawing at me. "Grayson, if I say no to your mother, do we still get married?" He didn't look surprised. He stirred his coffee once, twice, then answered, without looking up, "It would make things very difficult." I nodded slowly. "For you, or for her?" He finally looked at me. "For all of us." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt something break cleanly inside me, like the snap of a twig you knew was dead, but still hoped might bloom again. I stood, thanked him for the coffee, and walked away. He didn't follow. That night, I opened my laptop and wrote a letter I had never expected to write. It wasn't a resignation or an announcement. It was a declaration. I wrote it to myself. You do not belong to their structure. You do not owe them proof. You do not need to pay to be respected. And as I typed those words, I knew I hadn't just been insulted or undervalued. I had been given an ultimatum. And the only answer that preserved my dignity was to walk away from all of it. The morning after our final coffee, I returned the ring. I didn't make a scene. I placed it in a small velvet pouch and dropped it off at the front desk of Grayson's office building with a note that read, "You may need this for the next negotiation." I didn't wait for a response. He didn't send one. The silence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a love story derailed by one misunderstanding. It was a transaction exposed for what it truly was. That night, I sat down with Chloe and laid everything out. Not just the dowry or the dinner or the email, but every micro moment of control Meredith had attempted since the engagement, the calls to our product team, the sudden interest in our IP licensing terms, the new request to present BrightPath at a Langford-funded gala without mention of my name on the agenda. Chloe didn't say much. She just listened. And when I was done, she said quietly, "So, what now?" What now was the hardest part. I wasn't just dealing with a toxic relationship. I was trying to untangle the roots of a family's influence that had already started creeping into my company's soil. It wasn't just emotional. It was operational. I needed to be smart. I needed to be surgical. First, I documented everything. Every email. Every meeting request. Every remark that could suggest coercion or influence over company decisions. I organized them into folders labeled by date, copied Chloe on the backups, and looped in Amir, our legal advisor and longtime friend of the company. When I told him the full story, he didn't flinch. If they're using business leverage to pressure personal decisions, that's not just inappropriate. That borders on tortious interference. I asked him what we could do. He didn't answer right away. He just said, "We start preparing as if they'll come after you harder the moment you say no." For the next few days, I functioned like a woman with two lives. By day, I pitched our platform to school districts, reviewed user analytics, and finalized development sprints for our upcoming emotional resilience module. By night, I reviewed every contract tied to the Langford Trust's funding, every clause that could be interpreted as overreach, and every clause that protected BrightPath's autonomy. Chloe ran simulations with the finance team to estimate the short-term damage if we lost their support. It would sting, but it wouldn't kill us. We had 6 months of runway, enough to recover if we moved quickly. We began identifying new prospective clients' districts that had shown interest before but needed follow-up. We also flagged investors who had previously expressed interest but were cautious due to our Langford affiliation. Ironically, their fear of Meredith's control was now our opportunity to prove independence. 3 days into this silent preparation, I received a text from Grayson. "You disappeared." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "You stood still." He replied once more. "You're overreacting. It's just how my family operates." That was the last time I heard from him directly. After that, the only Langford communications came through corporate emails. All cold and formatted, like any other business engagement. But the tone had changed. I could feel it. They knew something had shifted, and they were waiting to see what I would do next. One night, I came home to find a package waiting at my door. No return label, just a simple cream envelope taped to the box. Inside was a printed invitation to the Langford Foundation's upcoming anniversary gala. Attached was a personal note from Meredith. Attendance expected. Grace under pressure builds character. I didn't laugh. I didn't get angry. I just folded the note and placed it in the same drawer where I had once kept the ring. That drawer was full now. Full of silent reminders that some people don't care about connection. They only care about control. The next morning, Amir called with an update. "I found something," he said. "Their family trust documents were revised 2 years ago. There's a clause that conditions continued support to affiliated companies on compliance with legacy values." I asked what that meant in legal terms. He said, "It means if they decide you're no longer aligned with their culture, they can sever ties and take any shared investment structures with them." I asked if that was a threat. He said, "Not yet. But it's a loaded gun in the middle of the room." That night, I called Claire, a journalist I had met at a Women in Tech summit a year prior. She had written a piece about founders being manipulated by power investors who blurred the line between personal and professional ethics. I didn't tell her my name. I just told her I had a story. "How big?" she asked. "Big enough that no one will believe it until it's documented," I said. We agreed to meet anonymously. Not for exposure. Not yet. But to be prepared. In case this became something that needed daylight. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in truth. And Meredith had spent too long assuming I would stay silent to protect a reputation that was never hers to manage. I had always thought that walking away meant giving up. But in this case, walking away was just the beginning. I wasn't leaving in shame. I was making space to move without their shadow. And that was the first real power I had felt in weeks. 3 days after I sent Claire the anonymous background materials, I noticed the shift. The Langfords had gone quiet. No emails. No meeting requests. No follow-ups about the gala. It wasn't mercy. It was calculation. They were waiting for me to blink first, to show some crack that might invite them back in. But what they didn't realize was that silence didn't scare me anymore. I had survived their noise. Now, I could survive their absence. At BrightPath, we were moving faster. Chloe and I initiated a hiring freeze to preserve runway. And our sales lead reactivated 3 major district leads that had gone cold. One of them, a private school network in the Midwest, was excited to know we were phasing out Langford affiliations. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very connection Meredith once used as bait was now a liability we had to actively escape. That weekend, we closed the quarterly review 2 days ahead of schedule and sent a proposal to a public-private partnership in San Francisco. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was ambitious. And we needed ambition now more than ever. I was working late that Sunday when Chloe walked into my office with an odd expression. "You should see this," she said, handing me her tablet. It was a forwarded message from our contact at the Texas Charter Association. "Just a heads up," the note read. "Someone from the Langford Group has been calling around, raising concerns about your software's data security. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen, trying to feel something. Anger, panic, betrayal. But what I felt instead was confirmation. They were moving, and they were using fear, not facts. It was Meredith's playbook. Subtle pressure cloaked in civility. Whisper campaigns. Reputation leaks. Nothing loud. Everything effective. That night, I called Amir. I read him the email. "She's escalating," I said. "She's using her name to shake our tree." He didn't sound surprised. "That tracks with her patterns," he replied. "But this gives us leverage. If she's trying to sabotage your business for refusing a personal demand, that's legally actionable." I asked him what that meant. He said, "It means we can document it. And we can push back. But you need to decide what you're willing to do publicly." I paused. "What if I'm done hiding?" He paused too. "Then you need to be prepared. Because once you confront someone like Meredith Langford, it doesn't just end cleanly. She'll fight to win, even if winning means everyone loses." I didn't sleep much that night. I wrote down every moment I could recall from the past 6 months. From the first dinner to the gala invite, from the wine in my face to the silence after I gave back the ring. I listed every call, every email, every business connection that had shifted the moment I said no. And when I was done, I realized something that both sobered and strengthened me. They never saw me as an equal. Not once. They saw me as someone lucky to be invited. And that meant every gesture of generosity, every deal, every favor. Every compliment was built on the assumption that I would eventually submit, and when I didn't, I became a threat. Not because I attacked, but because I stood still. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and called a team-wide meeting. I told them what had happened. Not with drama or bitterness, but with facts. I explained the pressure we had received, the reputational risks, the steps we had taken. I told them we were severing all remaining ties with Langford-funded programs and that we would be publicly issuing a statement about our commitment to ethical business relationships. I expected hesitation. What I got instead was applause. Small, quiet at first, but real. Our software might have been about teaching children emotional resilience, but in that moment, I realized our team had been practicing it. 2 days later, Claire published her story. It didn't name the Langfords. Not directly. But the language was clear enough that anyone in the Texas education sector would understand. The headline read, "When Business Meets Bloodlines: How Legacy Families Pressure Founders Behind Closed Doors." The piece detailed how romantic relationships were sometimes used as backdoors into young companies. How demands were made behind wine glasses and under foundation banners. How silence was rewarded and resistance punished. The article ended with a quote from an anonymous source: "Power doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes, it looks like a smile and a deadline." The morning the article dropped, my inbox lit up. Some were curious. A few were skeptical, but most were supportive. Other founders reached out quietly, thanking me for saying what they couldn't. One woman, a CEO in New York, wrote, You said the thing I was too scared to say when I walked away from a very similar man. Another sent flowers. Just white peonies. Knockard. That afternoon, Grayson finally reached out. Not by text. Not by email. He showed up. My assistant knocked gently, told me he was waiting downstairs. I said he could wait, and I made him wait. 30 minutes passed before I stepped into the lobby. He stood there in the same navy sweater, this time looking less polished and more cornered. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded. "Go ahead." He looked surprised. "Not here." I nodded again. "Then not now." I turned to leave. And just before I walked away, I said one sentence that closed the loop between us forever. "You never defended me. Don't expect me to explain myself." 2 days after I turned Grayson away, a letter arrived at our headquarters from Langford Legal Counsel. It was veiled in diplomacy, but clear in its intention. They were reevaluating the scope of partnership with BrightPath due to recent public misalignment in values. I printed the letter and placed it on my desk. Chloe walked in moments later, with a raised eyebrow and a single sentence. "So it begins." I nodded. I wasn't afraid. I had already begun building a future where their presence wasn't just unnecessary. It was actively incompatible. That week, we signed 2 new districts in Colorado, one of which had previously declined due to perceived entanglements with legacy networks. Claire's article had done more than expose the truth. It had cleaned the air. The board met on Thursday. 7 people, each of whom had invested not just money, but belief into what BrightPath stood for. I laid everything on the table. The Langford investment had always been a minor 15%. No a board seat. And no voting power. But the association had shadowed every major decision for a year. I proposed we buy it back. Remove the name. Remove the weight. Our CFO, a steady woman named Janice, had already modeled 3 versions of the buyout. It would cost us short-term flexibility, but it would restore complete control. The vote was unanimous. Later that day, I walked into the conference room alone, contract draft in hand. I called the number at the bottom of the letter. A paralegal answered. I told her to inform Meredith Langford that BrightPath would be exercising its right to buy back all minority shares under Clause 6. San. There was a pause. Then a quiet reply. "I'll let her know." That was it. No resistance. No protest. Just silence. A silence that told me Meredith never thought I would have the nerve. She assumed I'd negotiate, that I'd beg for grace, or offer some diluted compromise to keep things polite. What she didn't see coming was that I had stopped needing her approval the moment she threw that drink in my face. All she did after that was make it easier for me to walk away. The story traveled fast. Within a week, I received invitations to speak at 2 founder panels, one in New York, the other in LA. Not for the drama, for the boundaries. Founders were curious about what it meant to protect their companies, not just from market shifts, but from the kind of silent pressure no term sheet ever mentions. We were getting press, but we were also getting business. Our signups jumped 18% that month, not because we were trending, but because our values were finally matching our visibility. Meanwhile, Meredith wasn't quiet for long. She began circulating rumors through back channels that BrightPath had been unstable long before the buyback, that our data wasn't secure, that I had used Grayson to gain influence and then discarded him once we were funded. I received screenshots from 3 different investors showing identical talking points coming from separate sources. It was almost theatrical. Except it wasn't fiction. It was strategy. Her last card. Make me look like the manipulator, the social climber, the girl who got in and blew everything up from the inside. I didn't respond. Not publicly. Not yet. But I met with our legal team to document every instance. Chloe worked quietly with our PR advisor to draft a timeline of facts, complete with contracts, messages, and internal memos. If they ever escalated legally, We were ready. But my focus was forward. I spent that month doing the one thing Meredith never imagined I'd do. I kept building. I kept hiring. I kept presenting our software with calm precision. I showed up for my team. I gave talks on digital literacy in public schools. I sat with district superintendents and walked them through the platform with the same clarity I had before any of this started. And then something happened that no press release could script. A high school principal from North Carolina emailed me. She had just implemented BrightPath into her 9th grade advisory curriculum. She wrote, "One of my students cried after completing the first module. He said it was the first time a screen made him feel seen." I stared at her words for a long time. That one sentence reminded me why I started the company in the first place. Not to raise capital, not to be at galas, but to make something real, something Meredith couldn't quantify or control, something no dowry could buy. That weekend, I took a long walk through Zilker Park. No headphones, no phone, just fresh air and space. For the first time in months, my mind wasn't in survival mode. I thought about how easily I could have slipped into their mold if I had said yes. If I had paid. If I had accepted that love must be purchased and family must be feared. I had almost done it. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted to believe people like Grayson could change the rules from the inside. But Grayson never wanted to change them. He just wanted me to stop resisting them. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to ruin anyone. I just needed to remember that walking away wasn't failure. It was authorship. And now, finally, I was writing my own chapter without borrowed ink. 3 weeks after the buyback, Meredith Langford made her first mistake. It wasn't loud or public. It was an email sloppy, emotionally charged, and sent to the wrong recipient. One of our former vendors forwarded it to us immediately. The message referred to BrightPath as an ungrateful platform built by a girl who forgot who opened the door for her. She accused us of breaching unspoken understandings and suggested to the vendor that they reconsider alignment if they valued future capital. It was the sentence that gave everything away. Not the insult, the threat. Because it confirmed what we already suspected. Meredith wasn't just upset. She was retaliating. I printed the email, added it to the documentation Amir had been compiling, and sent a copy to our legal team with a single subject line, "Escalation confirmed." I didn't need to go to court. I didn't want a lawsuit. But I wanted her to know that if she forced my hand, I was no longer afraid to use my voice. I wasn't the girl in the navy dress anymore. I wasn't the fiancé wiping wine off her face and pretending it was some twisted welcome ritual. I was the founder of a company that had survived manipulation, humiliation, and reputational sabotage, and was still standing. That same day, I received an invitation to speak at a regional entrepreneurship summit in Chicago. The theme was ownership and integrity. The timing felt poetic. Chloe and I flew out 2 days later. I didn't bring a presentation deck. I didn't need charts or KPIs. I just told the truth. I told a room full of founders, investors, and nonprofit leaders that your name means nothing if you have to lose your values to keep it shiny. I told them about the wine, about the dowry, about the silence that hurts more than the insult. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. But as I looked out at the room, I saw eyes widen and heads nod. I wasn't the only one who had been asked to pay for proximity with self-erasure. After the talk, a woman approached me quietly. She introduced herself as an advisor to a national charter network. She had heard rumors about BrightPath being difficult, but now understood where those rumors came from. "We're reviewing your proposal again," she said, this time with fresh eyes. A week later, they signed. It was our biggest deal to date. The press release didn't mention the Langfords, but it didn't have to. Every school we worked with knew the backstory by then. And they were choosing to work with us, not in spite of it, but because of it. That weekend, Chloe forwarded me a LinkedIn post. It was from Jennifer Langford Grayson's sister-in-law. the one who had once endured the same wine tradition I had. The post was simple. It read, "It's never too late to reclaim your voice. Thank you, Kendall, for reminding us." She didn't tag me. She didn't need to. I messaged her privately and said only, "I see you." She responded with a heart. Later that evening, Amir called with an update. "They've stopped," he said. "The backdoor calls, the pressure, the quiet threats. I think they've realized you're not playing their game." I didn't ask how he knew. I could feel it. Meredith wasn't defeated. But she was recalibrating. For people like her, silence was not retreat. It was reloading. But this time, I was no longer on the defensive. I had my team, my vision, and my proof. And more than anything, I had momentum. The final confirmation came quietly. A small publication in Houston ran a piece titled "The Cost of Control When Old Money Meets New Boundaries." It referenced 3 cases of legacy families losing influence over startups due to unethical interference. One of the cases, heavily redacted, mirrored mine, word for word. A paragraph quoted an unnamed source saying, "She didn't burn the bridge. She just built a better one beside it." That line stayed with me, because that's exactly what I had done. I hadn't fought to destroy Meredith. I had fought to exist without her. That same night, I reopened a file I hadn't touched since before the engagement. It was a side project BrightPath had tabled months ago, a new module on digital dignity and identity for high schoolers. Back then, I didn't think the market would care enough. Now, I knew better. The next morning, I pitched it at our leadership meeting. No one hesitated. We started building immediately. Meredith had thought she could corner me, that if she couldn't own me directly, she could make the ecosystem too hostile for me to operate in. What she didn't understand was that survival isn't just about endurance. It's about adaptation, and while she was busy reinforcing her gate, I had already found the exit. I didn't win because I fought back harder. I won because I never forgot who I was before they tried to redefine me. And the moment I let go of needing their validation, I became unstoppable. 2 months after the buyback, I received a hand-addressed envelope with no return name. The handwriting was old-fashioned, angular, controlled. Inside was a single page folded into thirds. No letterhead, just a note. "I miscalculated. Your voice travels farther than I expected. Consider this, my silence." There was no signature. I didn't need one. I placed it beside the email Meredith had sent the vendor and stared at them both. One was a threat dressed as power. The other, a surrender dressed as dignity. Both belonged in a file I now labeled dead weight. I closed the folder and moved on. BrightPath had entered a new stage. We had just launched the digital dignity module I had pulled from the archives weeks earlier. And within the first 10 days, it had been requested by 142 schools across 6 states. Our team was working harder than ever, but the energy had shifted. People smiled more. They weren't waiting for the next storm. They were building in clarity. Our mission was no longer a mission wrapped in damage control. It was real again. And it was ours. Then came the awards season. I never used to care about business recognition. The best metric had always been student engagement and long-term adoption. But that year, our inbox began filling with nominations. Ethics in Business, Founder of the Year, Startup Integrity Award. I declined. The first 2. Chloe submitted the third without telling me. The announcement came quietly in my inbox while I was in a meeting with our product design team. I opened it like I would any other email, but paused when I saw the wording in the subject line. "Congratulations. You've been named the 2025 Integrity in Innovation recipient." The line that followed was more powerful than any trophy. You didn't shout to be heard. You simply refused to change your tone. I stared at that sentence longer than I probably should have. Because that was the truth. I hadn't stormed out. I hadn't leaked secrets. I hadn't torched bridges. I had just stopped lowering my voice to fit their dining rooms. The gala was held in San Francisco. I brought Chloe and Janice as my guests. They'd stood by me through every stage of unraveling and rebuilding. We didn't talk about the Langfords. We didn't need to. As I stood on stage to accept the award, I didn't give a speech about revenge or victory. I talked about alignment, about the cost of tolerating power structures that punish boundary setting. I said that silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's the most violent pressure of all. I ended with one sentence. Success means nothing if the cost was your ability to look in the mirror and like who's staring back. After the event, a man approached me with a quiet, curious energy. He didn't mention my speech. He didn't ask about my company. He simply said, "I liked your clarity." His name was Michael. He was the co-founder of a cybersecurity firm that had recently transitioned into education tech. We exchanged cards. Then conversation. Then coffee. It didn't turn into a headline, romance. It turned into something better, recognition. He never asked about Grayson. Never brought up the article. He just listened. Offered his own story when I asked. There was no pressure. No ladder. No unspoken price. It felt like a door I hadn't realized I'd been standing in front of was finally unlocked. Months passed. BrightPath expanded into its fourth statewide contract. Our module on emotional boundaries was adapted by a major district in California. The New York Times called our framework one of the most important developments in modern education tech. Meredith never resurfaced publicly. She didn't need to. Her silence was confirmation. She hadn't lost power, but she had lost control. And for someone like her, that was worse. Grayson tried once more. A message through a mutual acquaintance. No drama. Just a question. Would she ever talk to me again? I sent back one sentence. She already said everything she needed to. And he said nothing when it counted. There was no follow-up. But the most unexpected shift came from Jennifer. She invited me to speak at a quiet women's circle she co-hosted in Houston. A group of women married into legacy families, many of whom had endured varying shades of control, silence, and quiet compliance. I debated whether to go. But I did. Not to speak. To listen. To see if maybe the ripple had reached farther than I thought. It had. Jennifer introduced me with a simple line. She taught me that tradition without respect is just a pretty cage. I didn't say much that day. I just sat in a circle of women who had been asked to trade their worth for access. And I told them the one thing I wish someone had said to me sooner. You don't need their name. You already have your own. I walked out of that room lighter than I'd felt in over a year. Not because I had erased the past, but because I had rewritten my future, and it didn't require anyone's signature but mine. 6 months after the dinner that changed everything, I was invited to speak at a global summit on women-led innovation. The event wasn't glamorous. No red carpets. No PR hype. Just a simple stage in a neutral-toned conference center filled with people who had built things from the ground up. I had spent so long avoiding the spotlight that when they asked for my session title, I chose the quietest phrase I could think of: sustainability through self-respect. Chloe smiled when she saw it. Only you would turn that title into a revolution, she said. I laughed. But deep down, I knew what she meant. The entire journey hadn't been about taking back a company. It had been about taking back my ability to define my place in any room, on any terms. At the summit, I didn't talk about Meredith. I didn't talk about dowries or wine glasses or trust funds. I talked about how women founders are often told to trade likability for access, how saying no can cost you 10 years of networking, how silence is expected, even praised, if it keeps the system running smoothly. I said that legacy doesn't impress me unless it leaves space for others to build one too. That real innovation doesn't need a last name. It just needs breathing room. I walked off stage without checking for applause. I wasn't there for approval. I was there to show that quiet resistance is still resistance. Back in Austin, things were moving faster than I'd planned. BrightPath had secured 3 new international pilot programs, one in Canada, one in Singapore, and one in rural India through a partnership with a literacy foundation. Our team had doubled. I hired 2 alumni from public school systems who had once used BrightPath in their classrooms as teachers. Now they were leading our curriculum team. I watched as they built things I hadn't even dreamed of in the early days. And I realized something I hadn't fully accepted until then. The company had grown past me. Not because I stepped back, but because I had finally stopped holding it back by trying to protect it from other people's opinions. One afternoon, I was sitting in our new headquarters, a space filled with natural light and floor-to-ceiling whiteboards, when Chloe came in with a knowing look. "You have a visitor," she said. "Says he just wants 5 minutes. I told him, that depends on how you're feeling. I already knew who it was. Part of me had expected it. I nodded once. Let him in. Grayson looked older than I remembered. Not aged. Just heavier. Like someone who had been carrying the weight of too many unspoken things. He didn't sit, just stood near the door, unsure how to begin. I didn't offer to help him find the words. "I just wanted to say I understand now," he said quietly. "Everything. What I didn't say. What I didn't stop." I stayed silent. He kept going. "You didn't leave because of my mother. You left because I let her speak for all of us." I nodded once. Not in agreement, but in recognition. Then he did something that caught me off guard. He reached into his jacket and handed me a folded sheet of paper. "This is yours," he said. "My father rewrote the terms. No more stake. No more strings. It's clean." I opened it. It was a formal release of all residual Langford equity, dated and notarized. I placed it gently on the table without reacting. "Thank you," I said, not with bitterness, just clarity. He hesitated before asking, "Do you hate me?" I looked at him carefully. "No," I said, "but I can't respect the version of you who needed me to pay to belong." His eyes dropped, and he nodded. That was the last time I saw him. Weeks later, a journalist asked to profile BrightPath's evolution post-Langford. She wanted a feature on what it meant to build integrity into systems, designed to reward compromise. I agreed, but only on one condition. "No past names," I said. "Only future outcomes." She smiled. "That's the most powerful boundary I've heard all year." The article went live under the headline, "When Values Scale." It had no mention of wine, family wealth, or failed engagements. Just case studies, founder insights, and a quiet paragraph about emotional resilience, first in classrooms, then in boardrooms. When the piece was published, I received a letter from an old teacher of mine. She had seen my photo in the article and recognized my name. "You always had that stillness," she wrote. "It used to scare other kids. But I knew it meant you saw more than you said." I read that line twice, maybe 3 times, because she was right. I had seen it all, long before I acted. I had just needed the space, the silence, and the sharpness to name it. By the end of that year, BrightPath had launched a mentorship arm for young female founders navigating early-stage investor relationships. We didn't market it. We didn't brand it. We just answered the quiet questions no one dared to ask in public. What if your first funding came with emotional strings? What if the person who opened the door later tried to bolt it behind you? What if your biggest challenge wasn't money, but the silent expectation to shrink? We answered with a simple truth. You don't owe anyone your softness to earn a seat at the table. The real tables are the ones you build when there's collapse. Exactly 1 year after the night Meredith Langford threw a cocktail in my face and called it tradition, I stood alone in a studio in downtown Austin, recording the voiceover for BrightPath's new national campaign. It wasn't glamorous. No film crew. No makeup artist. Just a dim booth, a mic, and the script I had written myself. The final line read, "We don't ask children to fit in. We teach them how to belong without shrinking." My voice didn't shake when I read it. I didn't pause to collect myself. I knew what that line meant. I had lived it. That night, I walked home in the cold spring air and thought about everything that had unfolded across those 12 months. The wine, the silence, the pressure, the decision to walk away without fanfare. I thought about how many people had quietly told me later that they were proud of me for saying no, not because they could have done the same, but because they wished they had. People think reclaiming your voice means shouting back. Sometimes, it just means never lowering your volume again for people who refuse to hear you. BrightPath was now operating in 10 states and 3 countries. Our software had been named one of Time's top 100 innovations in emotional technology. We didn't grow because of what happened. We grew because we stopped dimming ourselves to stay digestible. Our values were no longer strategy. They were structure. Every partnership we signed was filtered, not just through legal due diligence, but through something deeper, emotional due diligence. Would this partnership require us to compromise our principles? Would it force us to tiptoe? Would it ask us to stay quiet for access? If the answer was yes, we walked. At a quiet celebration dinner with my team that spring, Chloe raised her glass and said, "To the woman who taught us all that no is a complete sentence." We all laughed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. I had said no in so many ways that year. To money, to fear, to silence, to people who said I should be grateful for the attention of those with more power. And in saying no, I had cleared space for better yeses. Like yes to the founder I later mentored through a similar ordeal. Yes, to the teacher who asked if we could donate BrightPath to her after-school group. Yes, to the investor who came without strings. And most importantly, yes, to myself, finally and fully. Months later, I received one last message. It was short. "She's stepping down from the foundation. You should know." No name, no explanation. Just a quiet confirmation that the woman who once tried to buy my silence had finally been asked to leave her own table. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat back and let the wind move through the open window of my office. Some winds don't require announcements. They just need time to echo. Michael and I stayed connected. Not as partners. Not yet. But as people who had built things alone and learned not to rush what didn't need saving. When we talked, we didn't fill the air with plans or projections. We just asked real questions. Like, what would it mean to build something with someone who didn't need you to shrink to fit beside them? I didn't have the answer. But I wasn't afraid to find out. In the final days of the fiscal year, I looked over our company's annual report and noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small section Chloe had added, tucked into the final page. It was titled, "Cultural Milestones." One line stood out, 2025. The year we stopped whispering. That line hit me harder than any chart. Because that's what this had all been about. Not revenge. Not validation. Just the quiet right to speak at full volume, in a room that never wanted to hear the whole truth. If you had asked me a year ago what I wanted most, I would have said peace. Now I know peace isn't silence. It's self-possession. It's knowing you can walk into any room, be looked at like a question, and still answer nothing but your own name. That's power. And the best part, no one gave it to me. I built it. Syllable by syllable. Out of every moment, they tried to make me smaller. So if you're sitting with a decision that feels impossible, where the cost of staying seems just a little cheaper than the cost of walking away, I hope you remember this. Your silence is never the price of entry. If they require you to disappear to be respected, you were never meant to sit at that table in the first place. And no matter how loudly they defend their tradition, your dignity is not negotiable. Have you ever had to choose between staying small for someone else's comfort or stepping fully into who you are? What did it cost you, and was it worth it?